I'm going to start introducing Queen Misty because I know she has a lot of content for y'all. So just to get started, my name is Angela Delphine Meckler, she, her, hers, and I am the mod for this session. So I'm here to introduce Misty Denham Barrett, who is an Associate Director of Residence Life at American University. She also has a cat named Mama and loves to work out in her free time. So I'm very excited for y'all to join us today. And I'm gonna let her get started.
Thank you. I also enjoy long walks on the beach and all of that. So thank you, Angela. Well, welcome everyone. I'm super excited that you all are here. And I do have a lot of content that I'm going to try and get through. I highly encourage people to please engage in the chat. I will try and look at that as much as I can, but if you've ever presented on Zoom, you know it's hard to look at the chat while you're also presenting at the same time. So feel free to engage there, and I'll try and pop in there when I can to see what's going on in the chat. But we're talking today about utilizing trauma-informed supervision, specifically in supporting our residence life staff. So first, just a little bit about me, in addition to some of the things that Angela mentioned. I am the Director of Membership Development currently, wrapping up my term. So we'll have a new Director of Membership Development soon. My love languages, if anyone is interested, are donuts and quality time. So if you bring me donuts and hang out with me, you're golden. My strengths, if you are a Strengths Quest person and by any means, are listed there. And surprisingly, mine have changed. This is a new list for me of top 5. So they can and will change depending on your life and work circumstances. So many can probably relate to the need to highly be an activator right now with everything we have going on. The need to jump into action is top of the list for me right now. So that's a little bit about me. So we're just going to jump in. But first, I want to remind folks that I am not a mental health professional by any means. So take with everything I'm presenting to you is based on my own experiences with navigating this as a supervisor and the research that I've done and the work that I've done to try and incorporate this into my practice. I am not an expert or a clinician of any kind. So just want to make that known. Please don't go and tell somebody that a doctor told you to any of this stuff, because that is not me. So just wanted to make that disclaimer. So hopes and dreams, or AKA our learning outcomes. This is, like I said, this is a long list, hence the lot of content. But I wanted folks to really hopefully be able to walk away with a good understanding of trauma-informed approach and some of the things that we're going to get into. So we're going to talk about vicarious trauma, coping mechanisms for staff, some support tools, ways to proactively destigmatize mental health in the workplace, and hopefully give some tips as well about how you can develop a self-care plan for yourself, but also help facilitate that process for your staff. So this is an ambitious list. I will give you that. That's why I changed it to hopes and dreams, opposed to just learning outcomes, because we may not get to all of it. So what is trauma-informed practice? Anyone want to give a best guess, maybe in the chat, what comes to mind for you when you think of trauma-informed practice or doing something with a trauma-informed lens? Oh, and someone asked my favorite donut flavor, maple frosted. Correct. Also, I don't know if folks can unmute themselves, but if you want to share what you think of for trauma-informed practice, you can also feel free to just talk out loud.
I guess I would say that trauma-informed practice is any sort of interaction where you're using or you understand trauma as sort of a salient component to the conversation, and using that to sort of like leverage that conversation of like, hey, this is informing that, and like being able to recognize and name that for the betterment of whoever you're working with.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey. I appreciate that. So trauma-informed approaches really just assumes that someone's more likely than not to have a history of trauma in their life. And trauma can be any number of things, life experiences, history, anything that might be considered trauma for someone. And those things have an impact. And it's really important to recognize the presence of that when we are working with other people. It's really this idea that people are people, right? It's this concept that we are all whole individuals coming to the work that we're doing, coming to the situation, and what comes with us is our lived experiences. And some of those may not be very positive, and that informs how we may react in different situations. So trauma-informed care really takes those things into consideration, and does its best to promote environments that are healing, welcoming, and promote sort of the recovery from those things, instead of what sometimes we can do, even inadvertently, is re-traumatize someone, which is what we don't want to do. So those are important things to think about. And I think sometimes folks can feel like a trauma-informed lens is something that you have to have formal training on, or that you have to be a mental health counselor to practice or to do. And that, I believe that that's not the case. I think at its core, it's about treating people as humans and remembering that everybody has a story that you know nothing about. And so living with kindness and leading with that understanding and that sense of empathy in everything that you do, it is really the core of true trauma-informed approach. So there are 5 principles essentially, or considerations that you should think about when trying to create an environment that is trauma-informed and that doesn't re-traumatize either staff or students or those that you're working with. So we have safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. So briefly to go over some of these, so safety, right? Ensuring that physical and emotional safety of your staff is paramount to making sure that you're not re-traumatizing them, or re-traumatizing students that you might be working with. Choice, individuals have a choice and have some control over their lives and what their situation is. Collaboration, making decisions with the individual and sharing power. And for those of us that supervise, we know that that sometimes can be difficult to include staff in decision-making processes, especially right now when decisions are being made super quickly, and often at the very top of the ladder without even our involvement. So that can definitely be something that might be triggering or re-traumatizing to your staff during this time in particular, that you might want to pay attention to. I know that it's definitely shown up in some of my staff, and been a part of our processing and debriefing decisions that come from the top down, and how to try and make up for some of that when they don't feel like they have power in any of those decisions. Trustworthiness, so task clarity, consistency, interpersonal boundaries. Those are things that are also really important right now as folks are trying to balance their self-care and navigate through a pandemic and public health crises that are plaguing the society. And then lastly, empowerment. So prioritizing empowerment and skill building is really important to creating this sense of trauma-informed environment, and really empowering your staff to do all of these other areas and to build their skills and to make sure that they feel trusted in the work that they're doing. So some of these may show up in various ways in the work that you do as a supervisor or as a coworker, a campus partner, any of those things. They may show up in a lot of different ways. And just for folks, clarification too, so if you're taking notes or things like that, I do have a link at the very end of the presentation that has all of my resources, as well as a copy of the presentation, that folks will be able to access everything. So don't worry about that if I am going through things a little quickly. So trustworthiness, as I mentioned, so allowing your staff to set up respectful and personal boundaries and being able to maintain them. And for me, the biggest piece here is when you mess up, because we as people always will mess up or cross someone's boundaries or make a mistake in a personal relationship with someone. It's owning up to that and acknowledging that mistake and allowing the staff to reestablish those boundaries and making a commitment to not cross it again. Because sometimes we as staff also, or even as people, don't know what our boundaries are until they've been crossed because we've never experienced that situation before, right? We've never worked from home before. So we're still figuring out a lot of, even months later, probably still figuring out a lot of what our boundaries are as it relates to working from home and navigating that experience. Or as one of our keynotes said earlier, living at work. For those of us that are doing that, or those of us that might still be working on campus. So empowerment, providing an atmosphere that allows individuals to feel validated and affirmed with each other and every contact. So from the one-on-ones that you have with staff to the casual interactions that you have with them, really finding ways to validate and affirm their lived experience and how that is impacting them and how they show up in the workplace is extremely important. Safety. So I think, from physical safety to emotional safety, making sure that spaces feel welcoming and where privacy is respected. I have had the unfortunate experience with a previous supervisor where I shared something very private with them in a one-on-one and ended up hearing another supervisor talk about it with me when they shouldn't have really known about it. And that's something that you have to be careful with in terms of who you're talking to about what and how things can get back to people. When we're in person at Makuho, we always say, be careful, the gossip, the talk in the elevator, because you never know who's there. So, making sure that you're being safe and creating that sense of privacy for your staff. Next, choice. So being able to provide clear and appropriate messaging about their rights and responsibilities as staff. So I think that is exceptionally important right now. At our institution, there's a lot of things changing and, staff are going through furloughs or different things of that nature. So really being able to provide clear messaging to staff about what is happening, what they're being asked to do, and making sure that feels clear and that there isn't any ambiguity really creates a sense of security for the staff. So as much as you can do that, providing clear messaging about what their rights are, what their responsibilities are, what they're expected to do right now, can really create a sense of safety for staff. And then collaboration. So providing a significant role in planning and evaluating goals. As I mentioned before, we can't always do that in the work that we're doing right now because decisions are being made very quickly or 3 levels above us as supervisors, and depending on what role you might have, supervising staff or professional staff or things of that nature. But as much as you can, soliciting feedback, trying to get information from your staff about the decisions that you're making, and really trying to build that collaborative environment with folks is super helpful in sort of creating a safe and trauma-informed environment at work. So that was a brief overview of that piece of it. I also wanted to make sure that I touched on the intersectionality piece of trauma and being trauma-informed. And this quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, really, if you're unfamiliar with intersectionality, I think really kind of makes it very clear, but Black women in particular sometimes experience discrimination in ways similar to white women's experience. Sometimes they share very similar experiences with Black men, yet often they experience double discriminations with a combined effect of practices which discriminate on the basis of race and the basis of sex. So I think it's really important that you, in thinking about trauma-informed approaches, that you are looking at the whole person and everything that they are bringing to the plate. And everything that they may be experiencing in terms of trauma and history and oppression. So looking at it from an intersectional lens is also really important, especially if you don't identify with their lived identity. I supervise a number of Black staff, Black women, queer staff, and I don't identify or share that lived experience at all. So I have to be sure to focus in on that and find ways to support and advocate for them in ways that I don't identify with. And so that is really important for me in showing up trauma informed with them as a supervisor. And then secondly, I also want to point out that studies shown that African Americans are just as much at risk for mental health as their white counterparts, yet they receive substantially less treatment. The US Census from 2005 showed that African Americans were 7.3 times likely to live in a high poverty neighborhood with low access to mental health services. So this is also something to factor into with staff and things that you might be working with. You may have staff who have not had access to mental health support in the past. And that may be a factor as they are navigating through vicarious trauma or the work that they're doing. So those are all really important things to pay attention to and to make sure that you're highlighting and educating yourself about those things as it relates to those that you supervise so that you can empathize and best support them and learn outside of your own lived experience if you don't share that lived experience. And lastly, true trauma-informed experiences or practices are anti-racist. Understanding intersectionality is critical. You can't, and these are my personal views, you can't say Black Lives Matter but not support the LGBTQ community. Or you can't say Black Lives Matter but perpetrate harm against women. Trauma-informed approaches are truly anti-racist in that they support all of these areas and do that work. So you have to really do some reflection as a supervisor and as a person and how you're going to show up in spaces with empathy as it relates to trauma. Because all of these communities hold trauma in a very different way that go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that is deep for many people. So the heart of the presentation really is about vicarious trauma. And so I want to also provide a second for folks, as I did earlier, to share what they may understand vicarious trauma to be, either in the chat or if someone wants to unmute. This is a very specific term. You may have also heard compassion fatigue. It's also been called countertransference or secondary trauma. So would anyone like to give a shot at what they think that this might be or what comes to mind for them, either in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself? Wish I had the Jeopardy music that I could play.
So basically it's in our work, we navigate very challenging situations that involve trauma with the individuals who are directly impacted. But that doesn't mean that we are not impacted mentally by those incidents. And so secondary or vicarious trauma is essentially the trauma we experience by helping others through their firsthand trauma.
Thank you, Angela. So yes, so this is a quote. I did a survey a while back to residence life professionals to anonymously kind of gather some experiences from folks around their experience with vicarious trauma in the work that we do. And this is one of the quotes that I got from someone who completed my survey that I wanted to share with you all that I think probably sits with many of us or many of us can relate to. And it's, this experience deeply impacted me in every way possible and will always stay with me, specifically because of the nature of the situation and how relatable it was for my personal experience and the profound feeling of helplessness I experienced. I have no idea what situation she's talking about, but I instantly get goosebumps and think about situations of my own that sit with me still, that make it difficult sometimes for me to engage in this work because I am still brought back to some of those moments of things that I'm dealing with. So this is common. This is a common reaction for folks in our field in residence life and in student affairs. There were countless other stories similar to this one that were shared in my survey. from situations where, you're, and they can range, right, from students who are financially struggling and trying to figure out how to pay for their on-campus housing and how to navigate that. How many times have we heard from a RA candidate, I can't afford to live on campus if I don't get this job. And then they do really poorly in the interview. And how do your gut gets checked because their lived experience and you want to try and help and support, but you're also bound to a fair and equitable process, right? So these kinds of things come up all the time. And then in the more, severe critical ways that we experience in residence life when it comes to crisis response and the situations that we may respond to with students, there are all kinds of situations that you will experience over the years potentially that may spark some of this. So just important to note that you aren't alone in this, especially in residence life. So some of the myths about vicarious trauma and or compassion fatigue is people will interpret it as laziness or burnout. And it can sometimes be interchangeable with burnout. If you're not really paying attention to what's happening to the staff, you may just recognize them as being burnt out when really it's something much deeper than burnout. Burnout is just as important and vital that we are helping staff navigate that and prevent that. But vicarious trauma is not burnout. It's something else. And then also we sometimes can believe that it only affects those with lived experiences or similar lived experiences. So, I experienced personal violence. So I'm only gonna have vicarious trauma with another situation that was also personal violence. When in fact, you may experience this with something that you've never experienced in your life, but you connect the emotions of the situation to what's happening with the student. And so it affects you more deeply. So these are some of the myths that come up with vicarious trauma and staff that are trying to navigate some of these situations. But the facts about it is that it manifests in a lot of different ways. It can manifest in staff as anxiety, diminished joy, the things about their job that they really loved and appreciated and really enjoyed doing before, all of a sudden they now don't care as much about those things. You may have had a staff member who loved coming to programs and who loved doing these kinds of things and signed up for extra stuff and was really engaged, and all of a sudden they have no interest in any of that anymore. They don't get any joy from those parts of their jobs that they used to. Cognitive shifts. So it can also affect someone cognitively in terms of how they show up or present in the workplace or present in their work environments. So these are important things to pay attention to. General loss of job satisfaction. And I think we see that a lot, especially in our entry-level professionals a few years in. What the reasons why they were so excited and to be in this field and to do this work, that slowly starts to fade. And they are not as satisfied with the work that they were once doing. Relational disturbances. So, they may have more conflicts with people on staff, whether it's their peers or the staff that they supervise, more disagreements with other folks, deterioration of personal relationships. They start isolating themselves from other people on staff or other people in their lives. Decreased satisfaction in their personal accomplishments. They might have gotten nominated for a McCoo award and then they win the award and they're like, it's not that big a deal. Thank you for the nomination. But that it doesn't bring them the sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that it once did, because they are suffering through vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. So, and it can show up as all these other things as well. And what the research tells us, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes, is that vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, it shows up with PTSD-like symptoms. It is not PTSD, but a lot of the symptoms that manifest for folks are similar or can be comparative to PTSD. So intrusion, avoidance, sleep disturbances, concentration issues, hypervigilance, overdedication, pain, distress, So these are all things that can show up for staff, and it's important to pay attention to. So how does this happen? How do we get to the point where someone reaches compassion fatigue or is so overwhelmed with vicarious trauma that they are manifesting these symptoms? This is another quote from the survey that I put out to colleagues and peers of mine. 2 weeks after the incident, the student medically withdrew from school, so I had to help their mother pack up their items in their room. It was an emotionally painful experience, and I did not sleep very well after that week after. Even now, 6 years later, I still get a little shaky, my heartbeat increases slightly, and tears come to my eyes when I think about it. How many of us, either like a reaction or you raise your hand, have, a similar experience from our work in residence life that still haunts us or still pops up in our brains when we're working, right? I think everybody has something or many things that still make it hard for you to navigate through this. And we joke about it a lot, but we also, there's not a residence life professional that I know that doesn't have an instant reaction to the Verizon ringtone, right? We joke about that, but being years and years of being on call, that is a trigger for us because we are called to react in that moment, and we don't know what's going to be on the other side of that phone call, right? It could be something super simple, or it could be, a student death. It could be, so we don't know. And so our heart instantly reacts to that. And sometimes it results in, hilarious moments out in public when it's a stranger's phone going off and you freak out thinking you're on duty. And other times it ends with you bursting into tears because you're just so triggered by that experience. So how does this happen, right? I think there are a lot of factors outside of our control that contribute to vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. School policies around counseling. We're lucky here at AU that we have a 24/7 call center for staff related to behavioral health services that we can call when we're in crisis. That doesn't affect our job negatively because our university has a strong policy for that. But there are many institutions that don't have that policy. Or don't include counseling in their health insurance benefits, or they're so expensive that it's a barrier for students or for staff to navigate through that. So sometimes it's school policies or departmental policies, HR policies that need to be changed. Lack of follow-up. How are you as a supervisor following up with your staff after they experience a difficult situation on duty or just a night on duty in general? The anxiety that I get just from having the phone, even if it never rings, is big, right? So how are you following up and providing care to your staff after their week on call or after their night on call? Lack of self-care culture. This came up in our mid-level roundtable a few minutes ago. How do you navigate self-care and boundaries for yourself when the person who supervises you doesn't agree to those boundaries or doesn't encourage those boundaries? So that lack of self-care culture at a university or within a department can really be detrimental to staff. Not prioritizing your own wellness, right? I have to set boundaries and role model and make sure that my cup is full before I can ever think about filling up someone else's cup or working with my staff to help them navigate through some of that. So if you are, constantly violating your own boundaries or the things that you encourage your staff to do, you are subconsciously telling them what the culture is and what the expectations are by your own behavior. And that's important to pay attention to and to know, especially for younger professionals. They model and pay attention to what they see in their supervisors and in the department that they see. So what you are role modeling and doing is just as important as what you are saying to them. So remembering that as you navigate through this. Institutional structure. I talked a little bit about this before, but I think that is also a big thing to think about in terms of, you may be a huge residential population and a really tiny staff that's asked to do a whole lot of things. And so how does that contribute to staff being able to care for themselves? Or how many people are on duty how many weeks out of the year they're on call because their staff is so small. So I think that those are some things that we don't pay attention to necessarily, that can have a big impact on staff. So what does the research say? I've talked a little bit about this. There is tons of research as it relates to vicarious trauma, in medical professionals, in social work, in community research or community activism, volunteering, folks who volunteer in crisis areas. But there's not a lot of research around how this affects higher ed professionals or student affairs or residents' life. So if anyone's looking for a dissertation topic, I got you one. And please send me your research after you're done. The graphic here on the computer is actually from a book that I read that was super helpful. And it's listed in my resources at the end as well, but it's this book, and it's called Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. So if this is a topic that is particularly interesting to you, I definitely suggest checking out this book. And it comes with a workbook as well that you can get on the side to kind of dig a little deeper if that's something you're interested in. But a couple of the highlights from the specific research for folks. I mentioned before PTSD-like symptoms. There's also a strong correlation for folks that experience compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma based on the level of responsibility you feel in your job or for that student, right? So if I'm in an interaction with a student in a crisis, the level of responsibility I feel for that is going to change how likely I am to really be affected by that. And I've worked with people who are really, really good at compartmentalization, and they are so good at their job, but it just doesn't affect them the same way that it does me. And not that one way is better than the other, but those are things that you have to know about yourself as you are navigating through this. There's a lot of gaps in the research, which I mentioned before. There's no real research around higher education or student affairs. There's also not a lot of research around vicarious trauma and how it affects different identities or different racial groups. There's a little bit, but not a lot. So I've tried to make I tried to fill in that research from other areas that I highlighted in the presentation already, but that is definitely a gap in the research that isn't out there right now. So in the documents that I'll share, there's a ton more research and articles that you can read where I got a lot of the information from if you're looking to start to dig a little deeper. So we're doing good on time. Some of this, so we might actually have time for some discussion, which I was hoping. So, okay, so some things to consider. And this is from the research, but also from some of my personal experiences through this, is being proactive versus reactive, especially around vicarious trauma. You'd be surprised how many staff I've talked to, even mid-level, senior level, who I say vicarious trauma, and they're like, what? So doing training with your staff ahead of time. What is vicarious trauma? What should they be paying attention to? Doing that with all levels of staff early on can be a proactive measure to helping staff recognize early on when they might be experiencing some of these symptoms or noticing that things are affecting them in a way that isn't healthy. So really trying to include that in either training or onboarding of your staff. Especially I would recommend for staff who it's maybe their first time on call in a professional rotation. Those are things that deeply impact folks. So having some training on how to navigate that is really important. Prioritizing wellness. Don't schedule things over lunch. And that's a simple thing that I do, but I think that is something that this all doesn't have to be rocket science or rocket surgery. It's sometimes the simple things that you can do to promote an environment of wellness. So not scheduling things over lunch. And I've I block out lunch in my calendar, and when someone sends me a meeting invite that's over lunch, I say decline. So, and encouraging my staff to do the same. So that's just one thing that my director here, she gives one exception. She's like, if I pay for lunch, can we meet over lunch? And I'm like, yeah, if you're going to feed me for free, sure, then we can meet over lunch. But brown bagging it isn't exactly the priority there in prioritizing wellness when you schedule things over lunch. Support resources. So make staff aware of their resources on campus and in the community. If you have an onboarding guide, include local mental health groups or community organizations, things that staff have used in the past to help them navigate moving to a new area. I know for me, that is one of the hardest parts about moving, is trying to find a new counselor and a new therapist and set up those support systems for myself as I'm transitioning places. So the more resources that you can provide to staff to help them navigate through that, the easier they're going to be able to cope and build out those resources for themselves. Work-life balance. So in what tangible ways do you actually support this? So we can say to our staff, we support work-life balance, please take care of yourself. But what are you really doing tangibly to ensure that staff are able to do that? And you know, I talked with the staff earlier, they're being asked to do a lot of late night programs, additional in-person programs. Okay, so you have staff that you're doing that. Are you allowing them to then flex the next morning so that they can come in a little later and get staffed and get that downtime that everybody else is already getting? So finding ways to tangibly allow staff to find balance or harmony, integration, whatever phrase you might use as it relates to work-life balance. And then destigmatizing mental health. This is a big one for me. I openly discuss mental health with my staff and talk about that, whether it's in a one-on-one being like, oh, you know what? Me and my therapist just talked about that last week. Here's some of the things that we discussed, or here's some resources. So I openly discuss that with my staff. And I think that not that everybody is always that comfortable or needs to be completely vulnerable in that way, but how can you destigmatize mental health in your relationships with your staff, in your one-on-ones or in your meetings? Allowing staff to, I've made it very clear with those that I supervise, mental health days are sick days. So you text me and you say, I need a mental health day. Okay, great. That's a sick day. You've earned it. Take it. You don't need to be, ill and stuck in bed to actually, take the sick days that you've earned. So I role model some of those things and really encourage that. And when I take my own mental health days, I say the same thing to them. I'm taking a mental health day today. Please check in with Ashley, who's my supervisor, if you need anything. And so those are, I think, sometimes obvious things that we miss in terms of just being able to role model and destigmatize mental health in the workplace. And then thinking about managing your own trauma. That's something that I had to take ownership of several years ago, was how was I managing my own trauma in the workplace and seeking out counseling and help for me as I was navigating through a really difficult situation at work after having responded to a completed suicide on campus. There was something that really impacted me, and I needed to figure out how to manage that own trauma so that I can then support my staff and my RAs and things of that nature. So sometimes it's really about taking care of yourself so that other people can also take care of themselves. Providing space. So what's your response following a major or event or incident? I think this has come up a lot over the last several months, even around situations such as George Floyd earlier in the summer. Did you provide space after incidents like that throughout the summer for your staff to process and discuss and talk about what's going on or how they're navigating through that? It doesn't always need to be public space, but did you, provide space for that in one-on-ones or different ways like that? So thinking about how you're allowing space for your staff to process and discuss how they're experiencing the world and these traumatic events that continue to unfold and impact particularly our Black, Indigenous, and staff of color. Finding time for play. This is one that I try to do as much as possible. And my supervisor is super supportive of this, which I love. Sometimes she'll just send a random Zoom link to our entire department and be like, who needs a break and wants to play jackpot games? Sign on to this Zoom. We're going to do it right now. And it's just spontaneous and fun play that people feel no obligation to do, but are like, oh, you know what? I do have time between this meeting and that sounds fun. So let me do that. Or we just send each other the gift library in Teams is on point. So sending fun gifts or just finding ways to encourage lightheartedness and play in work when a lot of that is missing in the real world right now can be vital to allowing staff some of that space. And finding ways to stay active. As Angela mentioned, I am all about the gains and the gym. And so that's a really big thing for me. So I'm constantly, trying to remind my staff to stay active and, whether it's a step competition challenge, how many can we get steps in? Reminding folks to drink water throughout the day, just kind of little things to help promote their wellness and them staying active. Can really go a long way, especially when right now our work is telling us all to sit in our chairs and stare at our computers for 12 hours a day. So those are just a few of the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of the things to consider. So as promised, Angela, this is the link for the session evaluations, which I will leave up for folks. You can also access it from the platform. But I wanted to provide this there so you can scan the QR code or use the tiny URL to provide a session evaluation. I would greatly appreciate that from folks. So now I wanted to provide a little bit of time for questions and discussions from folks. So I would love for that. And then I'm going to unshare my screen. But before I do that, I also wanted to share this last screen with folks. This is the bit.ly that I created, which will take you to a Google Drive folder of all of my resources, references, additional articles, the presentation, and I periodically will drop things in there. So if you want to just bookmark it or save it, I like to just drop resources or whatnot in there. I've been using this Google Drive folder for a while to collect things. So welcome to the Google Drive family if you would like to save it and add it to your drive. And then feel free to connect with me via email, Twitter, Instagram. I'm also, I didn't put it on here, but same hashtag if you're on TikTok. I'm such a nerd. Okay. So I'll put this back up at the end, but I wanted to stop my screen sharing so that I can actually see everybody. And so I just wanted to open it up for questions or things that stuck out with people that you want to talk a little bit more on. I know I went through a lot of material, like I said, very quickly. This topic could probably be like a 3-day workshop from like lots of trained professionals. So I know that it's a lot, but the bit.ly didn't work. I'll copy and paste it in here for folks so you have it too into the chat. Thanks, Liz. But yeah, anyone, thoughts, questions, struggles, maybe challenges that you're facing with this at work right now in particular? Go ahead, Tiffany. Feel free, just start talking.
Okay. So I came to this session because I don't know a lot about it. So I struggle connecting with my staff on some levels of those that have experienced trauma in the past. I don't have a lot of trauma in my past. I don't have a lot of mental health issues in my past. I haven't experienced a lot of things, which makes me very lucky in that sense, but it also can be kind of detrimental to my support of my staff and trying to figure out how I can learn more about this and how I can be more empathetic to my students, because sometimes it's really hard for me to understand certain aspects because I've not experienced them myself. I've had a few, I would call them crazy situations in my RHC career, but there have only been a very few of them. And so I think I've also kind of been lucky in that way too. But not all of my colleagues have that experience, and not all of my staff have that experience. So I was just wondering if I love that you created that folder and I'm going to join it, but I was just wondering if you could maybe give a recommendation for the best place to start for someone who really doesn't have a lot of experience in a lot of these different things.
So I'm actually going to be, and I'm not doing this just because I know you, but I'm going to challenge you a little bit, Tiffany, because I think that empathy is the core of all of this, right? And I've known you for a very long time, and you are an empathetic person. So I would just challenge you to lean more on empathy without needing to know all of these other things, right? The core part of empathy, and I have a whole other sessions that I've done around empathy that some folks here were at a couple conferences ago. So thank you for being repeat attenders to my sessions. Mike in particular, giving him the heads up there. But empathy is really just about being able to connect to something in you that has had that same feeling, right? So you may not have had a lived experience that is similar to that person, but you probably can understand what it feels to be, fearful, or what it feels to be stressed or anxious. Maybe not because of the same reasons, but you can really sit with someone in that feeling opposed to in that experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that maybe I'm just worried that I'm not able to take it a step further. I feel like I can be empathetic and I feel like I can sit in those feelings, but sometimes I feel like a lot of times my relatability to my staff, the ones I really connect with and I feel like I really help, it's because we have that shared experience. And there are a lot of things that I have experienced, going to college and all those kinds of things, but I just feel like I don't want to not be able to reach some of my other staff members. And so I think that helps me to know that you think that like just being able to sit with them in a feeling is good too, and not having to feel like I have to have lived through it to be able to connect with them.
Yeah, and I would also say, and others may agree, that you don't have to be all things to everyone when it comes to the people that you supervise, right? So I have a number of staff that I don't, and we've had this conversation, we can connect on a certain level, but there are certain things about the lived experiences of some of my staff that I am never going to be able to relate to enough that I'm going to be able to provide them the kind of support that they need and that they deserve, right? So I am completely open with them about they can make connections with other supervisors, other mentors. They don't have one. How can you facilitate them finding a mentor or a support that might be able to fill that void for them that you can't fill? And some of that is just checking your own pride, right? Like, I can't connect to this. And so I need to, offer that up. And it's not stepping on anyone's toes. It's not, any of those kinds of things, but this other person might be able to be a better person for you to connect with on that level. That doesn't make you a bad supervisor. It just makes you a self-aware one. At least in my opinion, my humble opinion of not an expert at any means.
Do you have any tips or advice for individuals who may not have a supervisory group who is as supportive and attentive to mental health days and being cognizant of staff needs? So specifically, those above us. I think that's something in our department that maybe isn't a priority and has not been a priority during COVID at all. So I just wanted to know like what your thoughts are for navigating that, because I'm sure it may resonate with some others in the room.
Yeah, it resonates with me as well in previous experiences that I've been in. And this is by no means encouraging lying, but you are under no obligation to tell your supervisor why you're taking a sick day. So, you can just say, I'm taking a sick day today, and they have no right to, unless it's formally written into your HR policy somewhere that you need to provide a doctor's note, they can't ask you, or you don't have to answer if they ask you for those things. So So I would just encourage you to do that. And sometimes it's difficult to get people to come around or to open up to those things. And I've faced that barrier before, trying to talk to staff and get them to be more empathetic and understand that. And sometimes that's a hill that you just can't die on, or like they're just not going to come around. And so you have to figure out ways to do what's best for you in that environment as best as you can. So that would be my advice, and what I have done in the past with the, I've had supervisor, I've said I need a sick day, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, really, do you even need a sick day today? Because we have this going on. And I was like, yes, I do. Okay, thanks, bye. And I was grateful for that, because and one thing that I think that I'm realizing more and more as I move through this like mid-level experience, and other mid-levels may attest to this, is that what I didn't realize as much as an entry-level staff is that I can't expect high quality work from my staff when they are working if I don't allow them the time off that they need to recharge. Like, I can't expect them to excel 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, if I'm also asking them to work all the evenings and the weekends. I can't expect the same level of work capacity. Like, that's impossible. And so I've had to really realize that more, and realize that that is not an expectation I should have, because as an entry level, I felt the need to excel 24/7, like to do it all the time and be super good at it, even though I was exhausted. And so I've been grateful to like unlearn some of that as I've progressed up, but it was a hard lesson, I will give you that. So we've got a couple minutes. I know folks may need time to go to the next session or a restroom break or any of that before they hop onto their next session. So if you need to leave, please do. But if folks have anything else they want to add or share, or questions or advice, not just from me, anyone in the group, there's lots of wonderfully talented people here. Thanks, Angela. But yeah, so I know that this is a lot. It's a heavy topic, so there's always more to talk about. If you want more of any kind of one-on-one connection, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So be happy to. I'm on the list for colleague chats if anyone wants to sign up for a colleague chat with me. Or you can just email me and we can set up something separate from that as well. So, all right. Thank y'all. I'll hang back until 4 o'clock. So if anyone wants to hang back and chat with me, you can, or feel free to leave.